There was once a king who believed he was the happiest man alive. His name was Croesus, and he ruled the kingdom of Lydia from a palace in the city of Sardis, a place where, if the old stories are to be believed, even the rivers carried gold. Lydia sat at the edge of the Greek world, where the hills of western Anatolia sloped down toward the Aegean coast. It was a kingdom of merchants and craftsmen, of fertile plains and ancient trade routes. And by the time Croesus came to the throne, sometime around 560 BCE, it had grown wealthy beyond anything the Greeks had ever seen. The Lydians were, by most accounts, the first people in the world to mint coins of pure gold and silver, small, heavy discs stamped with the image of a lion. And with that invention, they had transformed the way the ancient world did business. To understand what Lydia was, you have to imagine a place where East and West already met. Caravans arrived from the interior of Asia carrying spices and dyed cloth and stories of empires further east than any Greek had traveled. Ships came up from the coast bearing olive oil and painted pottery, and the sharp, restless curiosity of the Aegean world. And Sardis sat between them, growing rich on everything that passed through. The 6th century BCE was a world still taking shape. In Egypt, the pharaohs were building their last great monuments. In Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar had only recently hung his famous gardens above the Euphrates. The Greek cities were experimenting with something new. They called it democracy, though it would be decades before the word meant what we think it means today. And in the mountains of Persia, a young prince named Cyrus was growing up in obscurity, not yet the conqueror he would become. The world was full of kingdoms that believed they would last forever. Most of them were wrong. The city itself was built on a spur of high ground, its acropolis rising steeply above the plain. Below it, the river Pactolus ran through the market quarter, and in its silt, so the Lydians claimed, you could still find flecks of gold washed down from the mountains. Whether this was true or merely the kind of story that wealthy people tell about themselves, the result was the same. Sardis glittered. It was a city that believed in its own good fortune, and Croesus was its king. He was not the first of his dynasty. His father Aliats had ruled before him, and his grandfather before that. But Croesus was the one the Greeks remembered. He was the one who sent gifts so extravagant to the temple at Delphi that the priests there spoke of them for centuries. Gold bowls, silver urns taller than a man, a lion made of pure gold, so heavy it took 4 men to carry. Herodotus lists these offerings with the careful attention of a man who has seen the inventories himself. And you get the sense, reading him, that even 2 generations later the sheer scale of Croesus's generosity still astonished people. He conquered the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor, one by one Ephesus, Miletus, and the others, not with cruelty, but with the quiet certainty of a man who believed the world was arranging itself in his favor. He taxed them, but lightly. He admired their culture. He invited their philosophers and poets to visit him in Sardis, because he wanted to be known not merely as powerful, but as wise, as cultured, as a man whose court was a destination for the finest minds of the age. And perhaps, for a time it was. Sardis in those years must have been something to see. A city humming with confidence, merchants counting coins in the agora, goldsmiths hammering out jewelry in workshops along the river, the smell of roasting lamb drifting from the cookhouses near the palace walls, foreign visitors arriving with wide eyes and leaving with wider stories. Croesus presided over all of it, and he was proud. He was, by every measure he understood, the most fortunate man in the world. It was into this kingdom, at the height of its splendor, that a visitor arrived from Athens, a man whose words Croesus would remember for the rest of his life, though not until it was too late. Solon of Athens was not a king. He was something rarer in the ancient world, a lawmaker who had been given absolute power, and then, when his work was done, had voluntarily given it back. The Athenians had asked him to reform their laws, to settle the bitter disputes between rich and poor that were tearing their city apart. And Solon had done so carefully, thoughtfully, satisfying no one completely, which is usually the sign that a compromise has been honestly made. Then, rather than stay and become a tyrant, he had left Athens entirely, binding the citizens by oath to keep his laws unchanged for 10 years while he traveled. And so Solon came to Sardis. He was an old man by then, weathered by travel and by the particular kind of tiredness that comes from understanding people too well. He had seen Egypt. He had visited Cyprus. He had spent time in the courts of minor kings and the homes of ordinary people, and he carried all of it with him, not as luggage, but as a kind of quiet weight behind his eyes. Croesus received him with great ceremony. He housed him in the palace. He waited, as Herodotus tells us, for several days, letting Solon be shown around the treasury, letting servants walk him through room after room of gold and silver and precious things, letting the sheer weight of Lydian wealth do its work. One can imagine the tour, the polished floors, the gleam of stacked ingots, the soft clink of coins being counted somewhere in the next chamber. Everything arranged to impress, everything designed to make a visitor feel small beside the fortune of the king. Then Croesus asked the question he had been waiting to ask. He asked Solon who, of all the people he had met in his travels, was the happiest. It was not really a question. It was an invitation to be flattered. Croesus already knew the answer he expected to hear. He sat on his throne in his gilded hall, surrounded by the evidence of his extraordinary fortune, and he waited for this famous Athenian wise man to confirm what he already believed, that he, Croesus, king of Lydia, was the most blessed man on earth. Solon named Tellus of Athens. Tellus, Solon explained, was an ordinary citizen of a prosperous city. His children had grown up healthy. His grandchildren had all survived no small thing in an age when so many did not. He had lived comfortably, and when war came, he had fought bravely for Athens and died well on the battlefield, and his city had honored him with a public burial. He had, in short, lived a complete life, good life from beginning to end. Croesus, surprised but still hopeful, asked who was second. Solon named Cleobus and Biton, two young brothers from Argos. Their mother had needed to reach the temple of Hera for a festival, but the oxen had not arrived in time to pull her cart. So the brothers had yoked themselves to the cart and pulled it nearly 6 miles to the temple. The crowd had cheered. Their mother had prayed to the goddess to give her sons the greatest blessing a mortal could receive. That night, the brothers had fallen asleep in the temple, and they had not woken up. The goddess had granted them a peaceful death. At the very moment of their greatest honor, before anything could go wrong, Croesus was not amused. He asked Solon directly, did he count the happiness of the king of Lydia as nothing at all? And Solon, who was not a man given to flattery, said something that would echo through the centuries. He said that no man's life could be judged until it was over, that the gods were jealous and fond of disrupting human affairs, that a man who seemed fortunate today might be ruined tomorrow, and a man who suffered now might yet find peace before the end. He said, and these are among the most famous words in all of Herodotus, count no man happy until he is dead. He did not mean it as a curse. He meant it as a simple observation about the nature of human life, that fortune is never settled, that the story is not over until it is over, and that a king surrounded by gold is no more immune to catastrophe than a farmer in his field. He meant that happiness is something you can only measure in full, like a harvest. You cannot know if the year was good until the last grain is counted. Croesus dismissed him. He thought Solon was a fool, a man so blinded by philosophy that he could not recognize obvious good fortune when it was standing right in front of him, dressed in gold and ruling an empire. Solon left Sardis, and Croesus returned to his life of splendor, and for a while nothing changed. But Herodotus, who is telling us this story from a distance of more than a century, pauses here. He tells us, with a kind of quiet sorrow, that after Solon's departure, a great nemesis from the gods fell upon Croesus. The word he uses, nemesis, does not mean punishment exactly. It means something closer to a reckoning, a rebalancing, as if the universe had taken note of Croesus's pride and in its own time had begun to adjust. Croesus lost a son. His name was Hades, and he was the young man Croesus loved most in the world, his heir, his pride, the future of everything he had built. Croesus had been warned. He had dreamed that Hades would die from a wound made by an iron point, and the dream had frightened him so badly that he had removed his son from every danger he could think of. He took away his javelins and his spears. He canceled his place in the army. He kept him away from hunting parties and military exercises. Anything where a sharp edge might find him. And then a stranger arrived at the palace gates, a young man from Phrygia named Richest, stained with the blood of his own brother, whom he had killed by accident. He came begging for purification, the ritual cleansing that could lift the pollution of manslaughter. And Croesus, generous as always, took him in. He purified him. He made him a guest. when a great boar began ravaging the farmlands near Mount Olympus, and the local people begged for help. Hades asked to lead the hunting party. Croesus refused at first, then relented. After all, the dream had set an iron point, and a boar hunt was a boar hunt, not a battle. He asked Adrastus, his guest, to watch over his son. Adrastus agreed, and on the mountainside, in the confusion of the hunt, Adrastus threw his spear at the boar and missed. The spear struck Hades. The boy fell. The layers of irony are almost unbearable. The very man Croesus had sheltered from the consequences of one accidental killing had now committed another. And this time the victim was Croesus's own son. The danger had come not from outside the palace walls, but from within them, carried in by the hand of a man Croesus had shown kindness to. For 2 years, Croesus grieved. The palace was quiet. The gold meant nothing. And when he finally lifted his head and looked outward again, the world had changed. To the east, beyond the Halys River that marked the edge of Lydian territory, an empire was rising. Persia, under its young king Cyrus, had overthrown the Medes and was growing with the kind of speed that makes neighboring kings lie awake at night. Croesus watched and worried, and eventually decided that he needed to act not rashly, but wisely. He would consult the gods, but Croesus, being Croesus, did not simply send a messenger to the nearest temple. He devised a test. He sent envoys to all the great oracles of the known world, Delphi, Dodona, the oracle of Amphiaraus, and others, with instructions to ask each oracle, on the 100th day after their departure from Sardis, what the king of Lydia was doing at that very moment. What Croesus was doing on that particular day was something no one could possibly guess. He had taken a tortoise and a lamb, cut them both into pieces, and was boiling them together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid. The smell must have been extraordinary, rich and strange, meat and shell simmering together, steam rising from beneath the heavy lid. It was absurd by design. No reasoning, no spying, no lucky guess could produce this answer. If an oracle could tell him this, he would know that oracles spoke with the voice of the gods. The envoys returned with their answers. Most of the oracles failed, but the Pythia at Delphi, the priestess who spoke for Apollo in that smoky inner chamber of the most sacred temple in Greece, had answered correctly. The reply, as Herodotus records it, came in verse, and it began by saying that the oracle could count the grains of sand and measure the sea, and that it could hear the dumb and understand the speechless. Then it said, "I smell a hard-shelled tortoise boiling in bronze with the flesh of lamb." Croesus had his answer. He could trust Delphi, and so he sent more gifts, staggering gifts, even by his own standards, and he asked the question that mattered. Should he go to war against Persia? And should he seek allies? The oracle's reply came back across the mountains, carried by envoys who must have believed they were bringing the best news in the world. If Croesus crosses the Halys, he will destroy a great empire. It was the answer Croesus wanted. A great empire would be destroyed. He read the prophecy as confirmation, as a promise that victory was waiting for him on the other side of the river. The oracle also advised him to seek out the most powerful of the Greeks as allies, and Croesus, encouraged, began making preparations for war. What Croesus did not do, what perhaps no man in his position would have done, drunk on confidence and nursing old fears, was ask a second question. He did not ask the oracle which empire it meant. If you'd like to continue this journey through the ancient world with us, you can subscribe now. We'll be here each week with another story worth staying up for. In Sparta, Croesus found his allies. The Spartans, who were at that time the most formidable military power in mainland Greece, agreed to join him. They were already wary of Persia. Any power that could swallow the Medes whole was a power worth worrying about, even from across the sea. Croesus also secured pledges from the Egyptians under Pharaoh Amasis and from the Babylonians under Nabonidus. An alliance was forming. A great coalition of kingdoms stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates, all alarmed by the speed of Persian expansion, all willing to march together against the young conqueror from the east. Croesus was satisfied. He had the blessing of Apollo, the alliance of Sparta, and the largest treasury in the known world. He began to move his army east toward the river that the oracle had named, the Halys, the boundary, the line between the world Croesus knew and the one that was waiting for him. Croesus crossed the Halys in the late summer, likely around 547 BCE. The river was low at that time of year, wide and brown and sluggish, easy enough for an army to ford. On the far side, the landscape changed. The green hills of Lydia gave way to the dry, open plateau of Cappadocia, territory that had belonged to the Medes before Cyrus conquered them. Croesus captured the city of Tyria and enslaved its people, establishing a forward base in enemy territory. And then he waited for Cyrus to respond. Cyrus came. He marched west with an army that Herodotus says was larger than Croesus's own. Gathering additional troops from every nation he passed through. The two kings met near Tyria, and they fought. The battle was fierce and inconclusive. The Lydian cavalry charged and was met by massed Persian infantry. Dust rose from the plain until the commanders on both sides could barely see their own men. Arrows darkened the air. Spears shattered against shields. When night fell, neither army had broken the other, and both withdrew to their camps. Croesus looked at the numbers. His army was smaller than he had expected, and Cyrus's was larger, and he made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. He retreated. He would fall back to Sardis, dismiss his mercenaries for the winter, send word to his allies, the Spartans, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and ask them to muster their forces and meet him in the spring. 5 months. That was the plan. In 5 months, he would return with a much larger army, his allies at his side, and finish what he had started. It was the kind of decision that makes sense in a council chamber, where wars are fought with maps and calendars. In the ancient world, armies typically did not campaign through winter. The season was for rest, for regrouping, for sending diplomats to tighten alliances. Croesus returned to Sardis and sent his messengers, and he waited for spring. Cyrus did not wait. When Cyrus learned that Croesus had disbanded his army, he moved immediately. He force-marched his entire force westward across Anatolia, covering the distance so quickly that, as Herodotus tells us, Cyrus himself was the first messenger of his own arrival. By the time word reached Sardis that the Persians were coming, the Persians were already there. Croesus was stunned. But he was not a coward, and the Lydians were not a defeated people. He gathered what forces he could, the Lydian cavalry, his personal guard, whatever men were still at hand, and he rode out to meet Cyrus on the plain before the city. The Lydian cavalry was famously formidable. They fought with long spears from horseback, and no army in Asia Minor had been able to stand against them. Croesus believed, even now, that his horsemen could break the Persian line and buy him time. Cyrus had anticipated this. He had been told about the Lydian horses, their strength, their training, their pride, and he devised a strategy that Herodotus records with a kind of bemused admiration. He took the camels from his baggage train, the pack animals, the beasts of burden, and placed them at the front of his line, with riders on their backs. Behind the camels, he arranged his infantry and his own cavalry. The effect was immediate. When the Lydian horses saw the camels and caught their scent, the unfamiliar, sharp smell of an animal they had never encountered, they panicked. They reared and wheeled and refused to advance. The finest cavalry in Asia Minor was thrown into confusion by the smell of pack animals. The Lydian riders, to their credit, dismounted and fought on foot. It was a desperate, stubborn battle. But without their horses, they were just men with spears against a larger army, and slowly, inevitably, they were driven back through the gates of Sardis. The siege began. Sardis was considered impregnable. The city's acropolis sat on a high ridge of rock, its walls built along cliffs so steep that in most places no army could hope to scale them. Croesus sent urgent messages to his allies, to Sparta, to Egypt, to Babylon, begging them to come at once. He believed he could hold the city through a siege. The walls were strong. The cliffs were sheer. The Persians would batter themselves against Sardis and eventually withdraw, or the allies would arrive and break the siege from outside. For 14 days, that is more or less what happened. The Persians surrounded the city, but could not find a way in. The walls held. The cliffs defied every attempt to scale them. Cyrus offered a reward to any soldier who could find a way up, but the rock face seemed to answer for itself. At night, from the walls, the Lydian defenders could see the Persian campfires stretching across the plain below, thousands of them, flickering in the darkness like a second sky laid flat upon the earth. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the allied armies of Sparta and Egypt and Babylon were gathering. Or so Croesus believed. In truth, they would never come. They were too far away, too slow, too tangled in their own affairs. Sardis was alone. What happened next is one of those small human moments that Herodotus loved, the kind of detail that changes the course of history, not because it was grand, but because it was ordinary. A Lydian soldier, standing watch on the walls of the Acropolis on a quiet afternoon, the kind of afternoon when nothing happens and the mind wanders, dropped his helmet. It slipped from his hands, struck the edge of the parapet, and tumbled down the cliff face, bouncing off the rocks, ringing faintly against the stone as it fell, landing somewhere far below. The soldier, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps simply attached to his helmet, climbed down after it. He picked his way along a narrow route in the rock, a path that was not a path, just a series of handholds and ledges that a man who knew the cliff might use. And he retrieved his helmet and climbed back up. A Persian soldier named Hieroides was watching. He had been studying the cliffs for days, looking for weakness, and he had found none. But now he watched this Lydian climb down and back up again, and he memorized the route. That night, he told his commanders. The next morning, before dawn, he led a small group of Persian soldiers up the cliff face, following the path the Lydian had shown them without knowing it. They reached the top. The air was cold. The city was silent. The walls at that point were unguarded. The Lydians had considered the cliff itself a sufficient defense, and no sentries had been posted where no attack seemed possible. Why would they be? No one had ever climbed it. No one was supposed to be able to climb it. The Persians pulled themselves over the parapet and dropped quietly onto the walkway within. They found their way to the gates. They killed the guards. They opened the doors. And the Persian army, which had waited 14 days for this moment, poured through. Sardis fell. It fell not because Cyrus was invincible, or because the gods had decreed it, or because of some grand failing in Lydian strategy. It fell because a man dropped his helmet, and another man was paying attention. The great empire that the oracle had promised Croesus he would destroy, the empire he had crossed the Hollies to bring to ruin, was his own. The city was taken. The treasury was seized. The Lydian soldiers who survived laid down their arms. And Croesus, the richest king in the world, was brought before Cyrus in chains. What Cyrus did next has been debated for 25 centuries. Herodotus says he ordered a great pyre to be built, a platform of wood, stacked high in the open air, and he commanded that Croesus be placed upon it, along with 14 Lydian boys, and burned alive. Whether this was meant as a sacrifice to the gods, a punishment for resistance, or simply the custom of the conqueror, Herodotus does not say with certainty. Perhaps Cyrus wanted to test whether the gods would protect a man who had given them so much. Perhaps it was simply what victors did in that age, when mercy was a luxury and power had to be displayed in order to be believed. What Herodotus says is that Croesus was led to the pyre and placed upon it, and that as he sat there, in chains, with the wood stacked around him and the fire about to be lit, he thought of Solon. He had not thought of Solon in years. He had dismissed the old Athenian's words as the ramblings of a man who could not recognize good fortune. But now, sitting on a pile of wood in the city that had once been his, with everything he had ever owned in the hands of strangers, the words came back to him with a clarity that must have felt like a physical blow. Count no man happy until he is dead. Croesus groaned, and then 3 times, out of the depths of whatever a man feels in that moment, he called out Solon's name. Solon, Solon, Solon. Cyrus heard him. He was standing nearby, watching the preparations, and the sound of his prisoner calling out a name he did not recognize made him curious. He sent his interpreters to ask Croesus what he meant. Who was Solon? Why was he calling for him? And Croesus, who had nothing left to lose and no one left to impress, told him the story. He told Cyrus about the Athenian who had come to Sardis and seen the gold and the power and the splendor, and who had refused to call any of it happiness. He told him what Solon had said, that fortune is fragile, that the gods are envious, that no life can be judged until its final day. He told him everything. Cyrus listened, and something in the story moved him. Perhaps he recognized himself in it. He, too, was a king at the height of his power. He, too, was surrounded by wealth and victory. And here before him sat the living proof that none of it was permanent. Perhaps he simply saw, in that moment, the arc of a story that could just as easily be his own. He ordered the fire extinguished, but the pyre had already been lit. The flames had caught the lower timbers and were climbing. Cyrus gave the order, and his men rushed forward, but the fire was spreading faster than they could contain it. The heat drove them back. The wood was dry. The flames rose. Herodotus tells us, and he tells us this in the same measured voice he uses for everything, as if miracles and market prices deserve the same careful attention, that Croesus, seeing the flames and understanding that human effort would not be enough, called out to Apollo. He had given more to Apollo's temple at Delphi than any man alive. He had honored the god with gold and silver and devotion. And now, in the last extremity of his life, he asked for something in return. Sky, which had been clear all day, darkened. The light changed. Clouds gathered from nowhere, heavy, dark, rolling in from the west as if summoned. And rain began to fall. Not a drizzle, not a passing shower, but a sudden drenching downpour, the kind that turns dust to mud in seconds. It struck the pyre and hissed against the burning wood, and the flames, which moments before had been climbing beyond all control, faltered. The rain fell harder, and slowly, impossible as it sounds, the fire went out. Whether this happened as Herodotus describes it, whether Apollo truly intervened, whether the rain was divine or coincidental, whether the story grew in the telling across the generations between Croesus's lifetime and the time Herodotus set it down, is a question we cannot answer, and perhaps do not need to. The story tells us what the ancient world believed and what it wanted to believe, that the gods, for all their jealousy, were not entirely without mercy, that a man who had honored them faithfully might, at the very end, be granted one final kindness. Croesus was brought down from the pyre. He was alive. Cyrus, shaken by what he had witnessed, or perhaps simply by what Croesus had told him, treated his prisoner with a respect that the ancient sources all agree was genuine. He kept Croesus at his court. He consulted him. In some accounts, they became something like friends, two men who understood power and its limits, one because he wielded it, the other because he had lost it. Kingdom of Lydia was absorbed into the Persian Empire. Sardis became the seat of a Persian satrap, a governor who administered the province in the name of the king. The gold that had filled Croesus's treasury passed into Cyrus's coffers. The coins stamped with the Lydian lion were melted down, or spent, or scattered across 100 provinces. The markets that had hummed with Lydian commerce now hummed with Persian. The Greek cities of the coast, which Croesus had conquered so gently, now answered to Persia. The world had shifted, as quietly and completely as a river changing course, and Solon's words passed into history, repeated by philosophers and playwrights and teachers for 2,500 years. In every language the Western world has spoken. Count no man happy until he is dead. It is the oldest warning in the book, and the one we are always slowest to hear. Croesus lived the rest of his days in the Persian court, far from the rivers of Sardis and the hills where Lydia had once stood sovereign. He became, in a sense, a living lesson. The man who had everything and lost it, kept close to the throne as a reminder that fortune spins. What he thought about during those long years, Herodotus does not say. Perhaps he thought about the gold, perhaps about his son, perhaps about an old man in a plain cloak who had stood in his throne room and told him the truth, and whom he had sent away. The rain dried on the stones of the square where the pyre had burned. The embers cooled and were swept away. In time, grass would grow there, and no one passing through would know what had happened on that spot. Only that the air smelled faintly of ash and wet earth, the way it does after a storm has passed through and moved on. To the east, beyond the hollies, beyond the mountains, the Persian Empire stretched onward, vast, young, and still becoming whatever it would become. Cyrus rode at its head, and the story, like the empire, was only beginning.